Hello, hello. I'm very happy to see you all here at our monthly webinar, EUROSTUDENT Talks. Today, we're going to talk about digitally enhanced teaching and learning, as you probably also saw from the title of the event. And first, Michael Gable from European University Association will present us selected results from the DGHI project and reflect on his thoughts on the topic. And then we'll discuss the current developments from the institutional perspective. I will stay here today as a technical support, but the webinar today will be moderated by my dear Eurostudent Consortium colleague Eva from the ZHW, Germany. As usually, if you have any questions or comments, please raise the hand and let us know, or feel free to use the chat box and put your questions and comments there. So from my side, I can say that enjoy the webinar, and I'm handing over to Eva.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're at. I'd like to briefly introduce Michael, as we already saw that some of you are already familiar with him, but for the rest of us, Michael Gable serves as the director of the Higher Education Policy Unit of the European University Association, which is a prominent member organization that represents approximately 900 members across 49 European countries. And this membership primarily include higher education institutions and national university associations. Through collaboration with its members, AU plays a crucial role in shaping European policy and promoting best practices within the educational sector. In his role, Michael and his team focus on significant initiatives such as the Bologna process, the European higher education area, and the European education area, and Erasmus+. The thematic areas of concentration include learning and teaching, equity and inclusion, and internationalization. Michael actively participates in the Bologna follow-up group and several of its working groups. Additionally, the unit is dedicated to advocating for academics and students at risk, with particular emphasis on higher education institutions in Ukraine. Recently, the Higher Education Policy Unit of the EUA published another edition of the Trends Report, which provides valuable insights into how European higher education institutions are responding to ongoing European reforms. Under Michael's leadership, the unit continues to make significant contributions to the dialogue surrounding higher education in Europe. So we know what we already know kind of what the broader aspects of Michael's work are, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with his work and his reports. The study is introduced today. There will be links and slides provided together with the recordings of this student webinar at the end. So you don't have to remember everything and put down notes. If there are no questions at this moment, I'd like to hand over to Michael, so we can start with his presentation and we can have discuss the results later on. So please, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Marlene, and thank you, Eva, for... Can you see my slides already? Yeah.
Yes, we can. And now we can see the presentation mode as well.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting, and hello, everybody, and thanks for inviting me here for this opportunity to have a post-mortem on the DGHE project. It doesn't happen too often that you are asked to speak about a project which has been closed for some years now. You know, normally you speak about new projects, ongoing projects, and I was a bit puzzled when you approached me on this, but I really appreciate the opportunity, also because you probably point at something which is a bit in a dead angle at the moment, given so many other new priorities that we are encountering. We would probably just take the digital somehow for granted, or not our first priority at the moment. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have a reflection here, and I will try to answer the question, what is left of digitally enhanced learning and teaching in post-COVID, which I think alludes to the fact that when we were in the middle of the COVID crisis, despite all the, I would say, turmoil and all the grief that we had and the difficult situation, many people were very hopeful that this would bring a sea change to higher education, learning, and teaching. And I think many of them have felt quite disappointed afterwards. So we are going into that. I will probably not focus too much on presenting the results that we found at the time in one of our main project activities, which was about conducting a larger survey across Europe on digitally enhanced learning. You can find that on the website. We have had several webinars where we presented them, but I really try to put that into the larger context of what was the situation before and where are we now and where we might go now. So to do a bit of storytelling, and this is a very, I would say, subjective view of how the things have been emerging. I joined EUA in 2006. As Eva had said, I'm in charge of the Higher Education Policy Unit, which is basically shorthand for everything which is not research, which is not funding or governance or not quality assurance, which deals with Bologna topics, learning and teaching, lifelong learning and internationalization. And I would say until 2011-12, we have kept out of any discussions on learning and teaching. So we supported, of course, student-centered learnings and the approach of learning outcomes that came up in the Bologna context, but we haven't been too inquisitive of what that actually means. And I cannot recall any occasion where we discussed with our members, so usually the leadership of universities, rectors or pro-rectors, where we discussed what that actually means, student-centered learning. We left that to teachers, to academics who stood in the classroom, who had the responsibility at institutional level. And in my memory, this started to change in 2011-12 with the arrival of massive open online courses, MOOCs. And I remember the situation that when it came up, we monitored this, of course, like we monitored everything that came up and was new and interesting. And interestingly, for the first time, we got a question from our board about digitally enhanced education. They wanted to know about it, which was interesting. And I think it had also to do with the fact, of course, that this came from prestigious universities in the US, like Harvard, Berkeley, and. So what we saw, what happened then from 2012 on is what I called a vulgarization of digital education. And don't take that negatively. I mean, it's basically how you would use it in French. It's basically spreading it out and making it usable for everybody, referring to the situation that we had before, where basically in every university you had already digitally enhanced learning and was driven by a small group of committed people, who really believed in it. And when you talk to them, you had the feeling this is the solution to everything, be it inclusion, be it funding, be it better quality. You use digital, and it will improve. Yeah. And on the other hand side, you had probably another small group which were strongly opposed towards anything digital in higher education. They would probably admit that it is good for doing your driving lessons or learning some basic rules on a certain topic, but you couldn't use it in the academic context. And then people in the middle who probably had no big idea about it, and nobody was really involved, and there were very few people with hands-on experience. And I think that changed with the arrival of MOOCs, where it suddenly became also kind of prestigious to get involved into that. And I remember that individual teachers suddenly became very popular across Europe, and had thousands or even 10,000s of followers. And I think then what it also did is that it made lifelong learning much more visible and in a way also more important. And it started probably also with negative reflections, because people said, this is how they're teaching at Harvard. Well, we are doing that better. Yeah. So this, I think, was a paradigm change in higher education, which helped to move away from what we had seen so far, the primacy of research, and also revised slightly, not fully, of course, and not the immediate, what we had seen before, the low esteem for online and digitally learning. What we could see then in the coming years, and I'm reporting here on what EUA has done, but I think that's also true for other organizations and probably also for across the sector, we could see that learning and teaching um, became more important. So for our own agenda until 2015, we focused really on digital learning and teaching, but it became more and more clear to us that the issue was not so much digital, it was actually learning and teaching. And so we focused on that. And I just list here, I would say, our core initiatives that we had. We launched this principles and guidelines, also promoting more institutional approaches and also teaching enhancement, so training of academic teachers. We started to have regular events on that, which we still do today. So we have these yearly thematic learning and peer learning groups, which is an open call to our members, where we offer 3 to 4 topical groups. And then institutional leadership, usually at vice rector's level, can engage in that and deal with the problem and come out with a small publication in the end and also present the outcomes. And we do that in the framework of annual learning and teaching fora. I say that but at the time when we tried it, we were not sure that this would work because we had never had these kind of events really on learning and teaching. And when we tried to address learning and teaching, usually in our context, it was a bit, how do you say, there was a bit like we talk about a taboo issue and nobody really knew what to say. So that really helped us to reach out to colleagues at the institutions who were involved in learning and teaching in a strategic way. And we also conducted surveys which confirm that this is one of the major changes. So more institutional structures at the time, in particular the enhancement of learning and teaching centers within the institutions, and then also an upgrading of the role of the vice rector learning and teaching, who had before a much more administrative role and became much more strategic in challenged with the task to develop a strategy for the entire institution, but do that in a way that takes on board and involves many colleagues and students across the institution, not an easy task. And we could also see that, of course, in other contexts, the Bologna process started to have a first working group on learning and teaching in 2018, and the European University Initiative came up. What was interesting in all this in 2019, where we looked back and said what we have done over the past 5 years, what happened is we had always assumed that when we address learning and teaching, that the digital aspects would come in automatically. But looking at the programs that we had and at the participation at our events during the past 5 years, we had to recognize that this is not the case. This was not because there was nothing going on in digital education, but it basically happened in a parallel universe. So you had basically people discussing learning and teaching, and you had, aside of this, another strand where people were discussing digitally enhanced learning and teaching. So that was the situation in 2019 when we thought about launching a project in a larger consortium, and you see the how to say, the icons, the symbols here on the left-hand side, the Irish universities, several universities across Europe were involved in organizations where we said we try to think of how to advance institutional approaches towards digitally enhanced learning and teaching. And we had thought to do this through establishing a kind of a self-assessment tool, because we found out that many institutions were trying to get to grips with how to enhance their institutional structures and approaches for digitally enhanced learning and teaching, starting from tech issues, what softwares to use, to or basically trying to cope with the many softwares that we were used already across the institution, to who is responsible for what. And when we talked to them, we found out that they basically were sharing, they had very similar questions. They were phrased a little bit differently, they were grouped a little bit differently, they were addressed a little bit differently. So we thought, could we not bring that into a kind of institutional self-assessment tool, and that could be of use for people across Europe, which would generate some data also for us to better understand on how institutional digitalization is taken forward and where the main challenges are. And we had two main project activities there. One was that we tried to gather information on existing self-assessment tools and instruments and to understand them better. And the second one was that we wanted to run a survey to understand better what is the state of play and what are the current challenges. And out of our desk research work on institutional self-reflection tools or self-assessment tools, we found out that there were many of them already existing, including to the topic of digitalization. So we found very good tools, but we actually couldn't see that they were used systematically by any institution. So this was then also a reason to move the project into a different direction, but this will not be the topic here today. I will really focus a bit on the data report that we did, so a larger survey that we launched in early 2021. It was actually conducted in, 2020. It was actually conducted in the second quarter of 2020 from April to July. And well, as you can see, that was, of course, in the situation when COVID just had started. And so the survey was actually very timely, as this was probably about the last moment where you could assess the pre-COVID situation. So we asked specifically some questions on how institutions responded to COVID in the survey. But we also asked them to report the pre-COVID situation. And as you can see, we had a fairly good response from higher education institutions across Europe. What we learned through the survey, and as we had conducted a similar survey already in 2014, we found actually that there are not so many more institutions offering digitally enhanced learning. Already back in 2014, about every institution offered something. But what we learned is that the use was much more mainstreamed and strategic compared to 2014. So we found, for example, that 57% now, so more than half, use digitally enhanced learning across the institution. We also saw that the number of institutions which had institutional strategies on digital learning had massively increased by more than 20%. And we also saw that there was more support and coordination in the institution. It was more centralized and shared at central and faculty levels. So back in 2014, when we asked who is in charge of digital learning, this was often, in some cases, it was really pointing to some departments or even to individual academics who were in charge for the entire institution. This is gone, and there were more solid structures and resources in place. And another indicator, I think, that would underline how much more mainstreaming we had was that the number of institutions which had included it into the internal QA had more than doubled since 2014. What also struck, and despite the difficult situation of the COVID, that overall there was a quite positive perception of digitally enhanced learning and teaching, and also high hopes of what it would contribute to the higher education institution, namely enhancement of quality, helping to transform learning and teaching, improving student learning. And there was also a clear emphasis on widening access and lifelong learning as a strategic development priority. And this was underpinned by the finding that about half of the institutions had already short courses, non-degree courses in place. You could call them micro-credentials probably. which were offered mainly in blended form, but also sometimes online only or also in physical presence. And another finding here was that we found that MOOCs had changed. So it was not in terms that there were more MOOCs offered. This was kind of stagnant, and recent numbers show us that it might even go a little bit back. But we thought that they had a different emphasis. They were really used in a more strategic way for inclusion and outreach, so less so for international visibility as they were probably in the early days of 2013 and 2014. What we also realized, and that was due to the COVID situation, that the resources that the institution had in place were not sufficient. So basically, every institution had resources, but not sufficient for the entire institution. And I illustrate this here at the example of digital library access, which 90% of institutions had in place. But of these 90%, 65% indicated that this needed further enhancement in the stress test that the COVID situation provided. And what was also quite visible, there were differences mainly between the individual institutions. So, but sometimes, and regarding the degree of mainstreaming, but sometimes it was also between countries, and then it was usually due to the national regulations, which, for example, wouldn't allow to use, still wouldn't allow, even in the COVID situation, to use online in higher education provision. I think it brought up the question how to use digital then, and I think the rationales, they are all known to you, and they probably haven't changed so much. It is response to change, better quality, lower costs, so this is questionable, and then also environmental aspects. But also digital seemed to be quite good for getting evidence for the quality of learning and teaching. So it generates some data which can be used. And we also had some immediate lessons learned. Well, they were not so surprising. You probably have them also from other contexts, but you could clearly see that top-down innovation wasn't really the way to go. The innovation came actually more bottom-up stuff, and students tried out something which was attractive and useful for others and could then scaled up. So one of the immediate conclusions was that institutions should provide scope for experimentation, but then also provide the means and the support to mainstream those experiments which were actually successful and make them part of the institutional strategy. Peer learning and peer acknowledgement came out quite strongly. If you look on the graph on the right-hand side, you can see that when we ask institutions for what is the most useful measure for improving digitally enhanced learning and teaching, the first response is peer exchange within the institution, and then also in other national and international contexts, which is, by the way, not so different from when you ask them for learning and teaching in general. So digitally enhanced learning and teaching is not really a particularity there. Yeah, and then there's, of course, the whole issue of resources. And we also asked them about our actual topic about the institutional self-assessment. And I think everybody agreed that this would be useful, but also found it difficult to somehow factor it in, given the many other assessments that an institution has to undergo with regards to their reporting duties towards the ministry, with regards to external quality assurance, and. But all in all, I think it was a quite positive situation, and there were actually high expectation of becoming a learning situation and becoming more future-proof and sustainable. And many people had big ideas of what would happen post-COVID, how the lessons learned could be factored into a more continued learning and teaching scenarios. And in 2022-23, then we put up these three scenarios that you can see here, because this corresponded about to the situation, how we perceived it. So three different things happened. There was the back to the past, as we called it. So all teaching back on campus, which we have seen in many systems, but also at individual institutions, so that everybody had to go back on campus, and that digitally enhanced learning and teaching. So DELT became then more an exception and add-on a project, and that the learning innovation then came to a bit to a stop. And the rationale for this was, of course, the crisis was over. We go back to the usual business, and there were internal and external pressures to that, and also the reputation of being a real on-campus university. There was a second case study, or a second type that we can see that was as you like. So there, the leadership probably recognized that an institution-wide approach was difficult to do, also due to the governance system, that staff and departments had very different views about how one should go forward or go back to the institution, and that there was also uncertainty about the right approach, given also that the COVID pandemic retreated and left it a bit blurred on what would happen next. So institutions left, the departments, but also individual instructors, individual academics, a big leeway on how they wanted to deal with the crisis. And we think actually that was probably the most challenging approach, because it left out basically the question of, are there enough infrastructure for this? And it was also bad for the students who were exposed to very diverse approaches, depending often on the individual teachers. And it also didn't give really a response on the systematic transformation that one would have hoped to see for the entire institution. And then the third, our favorite one, and maybe you find a bit of a third in about every institution, this was integration into an institution-wide plan regarding a systematic build-up on infrastructures and resources, and also at organizational levels, and a continuation of what we have seen at many institutions emerging during the COVID crisis, a more participatory approach to ensure the buy-in of staff and students, and also to consider the important insights that they had on learning and teaching, and generally on the higher education institution and how it should and could function. This, of course, required a lot of investment in communication and collaboration. It would mean a continued experimentation and mainstreaming, and then regular review and adjustment. And I think there are some institutions which have done it, but I think nobody probably has done it fully and to the best possible way. Everybody had to make compromises, given also of the COVID and online fatigue. Many people wanted to get away from online education. So I think that was a bit the situation that we saw. And when we turn then to what has changed, and what stayed not only temporarily during the crisis, but what remained, in 2024, we asked our members again in the survey, the Trends 2024 survey, about the drivers of change for the past 5 years. And then you can see it here. If you look at the top 5, that's actually kind of really interesting. Digitalization and COVID-19 on the top, followed interestingly by enhanced collaboration with other higher education institutions. This might be also have fueled by the European University Alliances, and then also greening sustainable development, on which, by the way, we conducted another survey during the pandemic. And if you look, when we asked institutions of what have changed concretely and out of the crisis and which is going to stay, then interestingly, you find things that you may have predicted, like blended learning, teleworking for staff, and all this, a flexible learning offer. But at the top of the graph is actually the attention to students' mental health and well-being, which I think where the pandemic and the online situation that it enforced was a real eye-opener at many institutions and certainly led to more awareness on the issue, yet to be assessed what measures have been taken in response. So, moving from how I would have called it in 2021, from moving forward to what you asked me to assess, what is left in 2021. So we clearly had this back to the campus, and I think this was probably also inevitable. But at the same time, we assume that the digital transformations continue. What we can see is that there are some major changes in the institution, and I'm not going to read them out here all, just to highlight some. I mentioned already the rise of non-degree education, which are usually offered in a flexible setting, so blended or hybrid. By contrast, we see actually less flexibility in degree studies. At least this comes out of Trends 2024, where we think still this might be a conservative reaction still to the COVID experience and get everything in order and back to campus. Another area where we can see changes is internationalization and the interinstitutional collaboration, given also that our way of handling online exchanges is much more fluid as before. And I really think we moved from a situation where internationalization basically meant get into a plane and go there and then talk to colleagues and come back, to something that can also be organized virtually. We can see that in a clear growth of virtual exchanges compared to before the pandemic, which is of course also supported by Erasmus Plus funding and the recognition that it comes with, and also of course by the alliances and the high attention that trans-institutional collaboration gets these days. And we can also see that there is a new digital pressure due to artificial intelligence, which probably is currently at the state as 10 or 15 years ago was the whole digital issue. It's just emerging. We look at some some individual case studies, but no strong and mature case studies yet. We are not clear on how sustainability and greening are changing, given also that I would say governmental attention to this is not a very stable one. As you know, we are moving at the moment more to competitiveness, and while greening and sustainability is still on the agenda, it's probably not the most important issue. I'm here we are starting our annual conference in Riga tonight and tomorrow, which is dedicated to sustainability. And we just launched a new survey on this, which would allow us also to compare data with another survey that we did 5 years ago. So it will be interesting to see how institutions moved forward on that. And what also turned out of a recent survey, out of the recent trend study, is that there is a much more stronger emphasis on the third mission. So the contribution to society, which if you asked higher education, what is your main mission area beyond education and research? This is on top before internationalization and also before innovation. And I have here on the right our Agenda 2030 on the Universities Without Walls, which addresses this already as a general trend. And then also, I think that is undeniable, we have significantly improved digital capacity compared to 2019. Our Irish colleagues conducted a survey at the beginning of the pandemic where they found that a high number, I think only a third or less than a third of academic staff had actually ever taught online. And I think nowadays most people have it in one way or the other, as it has been enforced also by the pandemic. We see challenges, and one is clearly tech dependency, and that becomes even clearer in these days where we look every day anxiously to the other side of the Atlantic of what comes up next. We are relying on basically the services and the products from for-profit industries, and they have probably improved a bit more regarding fit for purposeness, more towards our needs, which was not the case before the pandemic. You hardly had any online teaching, but there are issues regarding technological lock-in, the costs, the regulation, interoperability, data privacy, and an issue which I didn't address here, but which plays a major role for our organization, is the changes, the reform of academic career assessment. Also because one of the early insights when we started to work on learning and teaching was unless achievement in teaching starts to count for career assessment, we will probably not see a better parity of esteem for education and research in higher education. And then there are all the geopolitical tensions that you're aware of. And also, I mentioned it already, changing policy priorities, the competitiveness compass, the union of skills, where we don't know yet how they are going to impact higher education and research, given also that we have decreasing funding. So I think this is what I would see as what is left here. And I stop sharing here so that I can see you better.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think Eva already has some questions, or you want to open the Q&A for the audience right away as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would firstly like to ask, is there any questions from the audience, and leave room for that. Otherwise, we start discussing and maybe some questions come along. Anna Rechberger has one question. Anna, please.
Yes, I'm sorry for the bad audio. I don't have a headset. I hope you can all hear me.
Very good.
Question concerning the pie chart that was in the first half of your presentation. It showed blended learning percentages. There was I think an EHEA and EH.
Yeah, I think sorry, I should have said that. I think it was 75% in average across Europe.
Yes.
But then you had some countries where it is 100%, which
Yes,
also.
I was wondering what that meant, 100%, like each institution.
Yes.
It.
Yeah, where
Yeah.
all institutions said that they have it.
Oh.
And I think I remember this was one example for country differences, because in some countries, I think blended learning was not legally permitted. And while some individuals and faculties did it, I think you get away with it if you kept it to a minimum, yeah, but you were not allowed to do this officially. In some systems, this changed due to COVID. In others, it's changed temporarily and they moved back to it afterwards.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't see any raised hands or questions in this chat. So I'd like to come back on two aspects you mentioned. The role of peer learning for transformation, institutional change in digitalization, digitally enhanced internationalization, because you touched upon it. But maybe this is kind of a point to discuss, like what is left after COVID, or what were the great changes. And this also leads like where the sustainable changes can be expected. I mean, you touched upon it. I'd like to add some more or a note from a research project I've been working on until the end of last year, where we interviewed heads of international offices and we asked them what were the changes due to COVID. I mean, we started in 2023, so we were after your survey, and they were all like, "Oh, COVID didn't change anything."
Okay.
But then they started talking, and while they were talking about what changed, they realized COVID changed a lot, but they internalized all the changes so much already that they do not see them as changes. like okay, remote working from remotely is normal right now. So I was wondering, did you also notice more sustainable changes that maybe interviews or surveyed respondents did at first not realize that it's really a change due to the pandemic or in recent years because it was so internalized, or that were they very clear on what the changes are?
I think that's difficult for us to assess, but probably we also haven't asked the question, or we in 2023, I mean, fair enough, you know, if you are an institution which has physical premises, it's kind of logical that you went back to campus. And I think there is also a clear understanding that you want staff and students to come back then to campus. So it was more the question on how you actually regulate that and find a good approach for this. And I think that is something that was difficult for institutions to do because of some of the reasons that I mentioned, because also of the legal system, which required, for example, staff and students to be on campus. And so I think that's in this situation, it's difficult to make out a clear use case of what is a good way of integrating digitally enhanced than in the day-to-day learning and teaching practice. So what we saw in interviews and in exchanges with staff from institutions, it's a little bit what you said. Some things have clearly changed. I think I mentioned, for example, teleworking for administrative staff, like in other industries as well. You know, that's probably a no-brainer, but also a bit more of flexibility there. But if you wanted to look for real changes, and this is today taken for granted, but what was probably not there before the crisis and which you could do now is to have these online exchanges in an international, in a institutional setting. And this is simply something that you can't really replace. Yeah. So we know that there has been a lots of experimentation, and that's still ongoing with also with hybrid teaching, for example, but that this is still something that is enormously resource intensive. And the question is if this is really a way forward, given also that teachers, for example, they face two different teaching situations. On the one hand side, they have people in the classroom, in the lecture hall, and on the other hand, they have those attending online. So that's probably not an easy case. Yeah. But I think generally, I would agree with you. If you ask people today, they would say, oh, nothing have changed. But they may ignore all the things that they do on a day-to-day basis, which they haven't been doing before 2020.
Yeah, thank you. Before going to the question, this chat, I would like to add this. What was also in your results and the results of the industrial work project I worked on last year is that you mentioned the more solid structures within higher education institutions and the development of specific units dealing with digital learning, teaching, learning, IT units. We realized for at least for German higher education institutions, there was a shift from more working together with the legal department, with the IT department, more kind of stronger internal networks in the universities than before COVID. Before COVID, the structures were more based on the departments, and the teaching stuff was like kind of left alone with their teaching and how they design it, and that these units gained kind of more relevance and also direct contact to the heads of institutions. Do you think this is kind of a German specific, or did you see that or find that in other European higher education systems as well?
I think what we can see is it's difficult to talk about this because inside Germany the structures are probably, I mean, I know it's very diverse also due to the lenders but they're probably more aligned than at a European level. So it's sometimes not easy what people understand under a digital office. But our feeling is that this is becoming more strategic and more agenda setting, and better resourced. I think before it had often a kind of ancillary function, so to help you out on some tech issues that he wanted to do. And now this is also probably it has often been merged or included into the learning and teaching offices that we have seen emerging, which are often closely working with the vice rector in charge for learning and teaching. And they also address issues now as staff development, which I think I pointed briefly to the discussion on the reform of academic career assessment, where we probably also still have a lot of enhancement, a lot of changes ahead. But we can see that the overall the acceptance of pedagogical training, however you might call that, staff development, that this has strongly has been enhanced and has been improved over the past 10 years.
Okay, thank you. I'd now like to come to the questions in the chat. Herwig Rehacek, would you like to like pose your question yourself, or do you want me to read it out? I think it's more.
I can also tell it by myself,
Okay.
no problem. So you presented this scenario, Michael, with back to the past as you like it and future now. I just wanted to know if is there any data available? How many
No.
universities in Europe switch to which scenario?
No, we haven't really assessed that. I mean, that was basically what we tried to promote at the time, also to build awareness about the opportunity that is out there. And because we learned from some institutions that they basically said, yeah, we don't know really in what direction we go, but we also think that many of the things that we tried out during COVID crisis, this is actually quite good. And even if not the entire institution wants it, we want to take it forward into a pilot, an experiment, counting on the on the willing ones, you know, through a coalition on the willing. And I think we found that important, and also to keep it open for experimentation. And I think that's probably also something that we see now with regards to AI. Nobody knows how to take that forward and how to have the best use or secure use, let away, yeah. So that's what we really see. I would say this would be our suggestion on how a development paradigm could look for higher education institutions. So try to bring together a coalition of people who want to do it, discuss it, come forward with a pilot, try it out, and then try to promote it throughout the institution.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. I think this is still something, but which is, I mean, positive, but also has, of course, some downsides also within institutions. You rely to a high extent on the goodwill of people to buy in. Yeah?
Yeah.
It made really for the strength, I think, of higher education institutions in the COVID crisis. And I remember that, I don't know from whom that came, OECD or so, which wondered that higher educations, which were always regarded as slow in change, and how many of them pivoted so quickly to a new mode of working, and then concluded that this was probably due to the collegial system and the fact that we share responsibilities, yeah, and everybody is, not everybody, but the majority of the people feel somehow responsible and in charge if something has to be done. And I think that's something we have to keep. So keep this culture of innovation, but not by forcing everybody to use a new tool every other year, yeah, but by trying to find out what are the things that actually work. And I think that's also something that we learned already in the early discussions on, I remember 2014, the Commission came forward and also others and said, oh, the things that are happening in the US, and there is this innovation, and they change it like this. Nobody has a blueprint on how innovative good teaching could look like. Yeah, I think we have to try it out and see what are the results.
Yeah, it's an individual process, so it depends mostly on the person. So this is always my thing.
Yeah.
So the technology can support you, yeah, but normally the person has to decide which is good and which is bad for her. Yeah. And we can give them some tools and say, yeah, you can use it, or
But
you don't have to.
Yeah, indeed. But what we have probably to do is we have to keep on communicating and
Yes.
exchanging about that, because otherwise everybody has to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
exactly.
I think that's the one thing that is important. And
Yeah.
this has been done in some countries very well. I remember during COVID, I was in several meetings in the Irish context, you know, where they got everybody together and exchanged about how to change things, what worked in the institution. So also very practical. And I think that's the culture that we need here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. There's another question in the chat by John Katsavinakis. Would you like to pose it yourself, or I can
Yeah, no,
also
I
read
can
out?
see it. So what's an
Yeah.
audit-like process that you mentioned? I mean, an audit is, of course, it's a particular QA approach, yeah, for external quality assurance, usually that you audit an institution. And I think many of these self-assessment tools, and I can share also a link on this. The reason why we didn't follow it up is that in our desk study, we found in a short period of time almost 30 self-assessment tools. And then we said, we are not going to develop the 31st one. We try to find out, can we use one of them? And then we found actually that only we couldn't make out good use cases. So you always had some institutions which tried them out and thought they were good, but they didn't really become a mass movement. And I think there were several reasons to that. And one of the reasons was that all institutions are already in something like quality assurance processes. So you have to assess your learning and teaching. You have to report on it, and then somebody comes from the outside with yet another tool and asks you to go through that. And these things are quite resource intensive, you know. So you have to involve staff and students into this. So it is quite a bit of work, yeah. So I think that's probably, but this is probably what every institution should do from time to time. Either you have it as a standalone that you say, we try to find out how good are we on greening, how good are we on student participation, how good are we on digitally enhanced learning. You can think about different topics and themes, or you make that part of your regular quality assurance processes.
Thank you.
I think this is a nice coming to the end of our discussion, talking about students, because what I realized during the industrial study on digitally enhanced transformation of internationalization was that we did interviews of about 1.5 hours, 2 hours, and students were rarely mentioned by administrative staff working in the higher education institutions, and in this talk as well. So I would like to, and also because it's the EUROSTUDENT talk, also focus a little bit on, so what has changed for students, or what are the measures that students have adopted with digital enhanced learning and teaching. And the most prominent one is, I guess, virtual mobility, which is something we tried also to figure out with EUROSTUDENT, and we adapted our questionnaire to find out more about it. But also the claims of inclusivity was always claimed that blended intensive programs or virtual mobility is more inclusive and opens up the kind of mobility experience to students who can't be mobile physically. Do you have any findings on that? If this claim is like if this claim is holding up, or if it can be contested? I mean, I have some findings from the German context, but what's kind of the overall European view on it? Does do all these virtual exchange programs or blended intensive programs really open up to new groups of students, or is it kind of the more come again same students who also participate in physical mobility?
I think it can help you to do this, but you may have to want it. It doesn't happen automatically. That would be my conclusion. And this is, I think, what we have seen throughout the last 15 years in digitally enhanced learning and teaching. I still remember the early promises that MOOC MOOCs would revolutionize education, make that available to everybody, and would lead to inclusion. I think we haven't seen that, at least not in Europe. If we look at who uses MOOCs, then these are usually people who are in higher education or have been in higher education. And I think that goes for everything that you do digitally or virtually. I think you have to set the purpose that this should be inclusive and also think of how to do this. It's basically not only about the digital case. I think this is also when you provide grants, whatever you need, it will not happen automatically. That's the one conclusion that we have there. If you have it about students as partners in institutions, but there I'm, of course, I mean, we are representing universities, so which claim to be to represent which have members which are staff and students. So we also speak for students in a way. But I recognize that there can be that students and staff may have different interests that they do not automatically align. And I think my impression is that we have made major progress, at least at the policy level, on student participation. Let me phrase it like this, So I think nobody would stand up today and contest that students should be involved in the institution and have to be involved. I can see there are some national cultures where this is very pronounced. Again, I can point to our Irish colleagues there, and I think they have also enforced it during the COVID crisis. And I think many institutions actually realized during the COVID crisis, you do not only need the teachers, you also need the students, you need the colleagues from the tech services, and so you get a more holistic vision of what it actually needs to provide good education. You can compare that with the example of a surgeon. Of course, it needs the surgeon to do the cuts, and she has probably the main responsibility there. But this is really a collective work. You need lots of people around them, starting from the person who sits at the desk and registers patients. And I think this is how we have to look, probably in a modern way of learning and teaching, which brings me again to the way on how we look on the task of academics. And I think nowadays you can't see teaching only as the task of the professor who stands in the class and teaches, but it's also to be seen in the context of the services that the institution provides to students, the student support, quality assurance, and when you bring technology in, it's even clearer. Yeah? It's not just somebody who plugs in the machines. You need somebody who understands learning and teaching, helps with the design of programs, and so I think I was deviating from your from your question.
No, but
I can't tell you, has that really happened? Is there more importantly also more meaningful participation of students in institutions? I can't say, but maybe colleagues here have views on that, whether they have the feeling COVID changed this.
Yeah, I think John contributed to it in the chat and said it's more that COVID surely provided it for the Greek system, and that it's also reflected in the legislation. This is also a big issue, like higher education institutions are slow, but legislation and policymakers are even slower, I'd say. So you have really legal issues with like virtual exchange of students, and I think it took some time to figure it out. So I think we're not done with assessing what are the changes and what are the challenges and barriers. I think we could discuss this for, I don't know, at least a couple of hours, but maybe we come back to this next year or and do a reassessment of further findings we have. But I think we're done for today since our time is up. I would say, Michael, thank you very much. I still have tons of notes. I could continue for hours.
Great.
Maybe we do a kind of serious what's left of this, what's left of that, with all the reports that came out. I'd like to thank all the participants for contributing and listening, and I'd like to hand over to Marlene for information on the next EUROSTUDENT Talks and kind of wrapping up this session.
Yes, of course. Also from my side, many thanks to our listeners, to Michael, that you agreed to come and join us and share your thoughts. And of course, many thanks to Eva for doing this moderating job here so wonderfully. And yes, you can already save the date for the next EUROSTUDENT Talks. It will be the 15th of May, and then our focus will be on international mobility with a special focus on Sweden, how Sweden is doing when it comes to studying abroad and going abroad for internship. And we will again also see Eva, who will reflect on EUROSTUDENT 8 results, averages, outliners when it comes to international mobility. So stay tuned and see you on the 15th of May. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.